Governments have always been desperate for your money, but their methods haven't always been this sane. We're about to show you 32 times rulers decided to tax your beard, the light in your window, and even your own soul. This isn't just history. It's a catalog of humanity's most brilliantly absurd attempts to fill the treasury, each one dumber and more creative than the last. 1. In 1662, the English Parliament, hunting for cash, cooked up what they thought was a foolproof plan: the hearth tax. Their reasoning was straightforward enough. Every house has a fireplace, and the rich have lots of them, so let's tax every single one. What they didn't anticipate was the public's reaction, which turned into a national cat-and-mouse game with the tax collectors, famously known as chimney men. Homeowners became masters of deception, bricking up their fireplaces or concealing them with fake walls just before an inspection. The most popular and frankly insane strategy was to re-engineer their own houses, funneling multiple fireplace flues into one enormous chimney. The hope was the inspector would see one chimney and charge for one hearth. The reality was that these DIY home improvement projects often led to rooms filled with smoke, deadly carbon monoxide poisoning, and, in a twist of beautiful irony, catastrophic house fires. People risked their homes burning down to avoid a tax on fire. 2. In the Roman Empire, even the price of freedom wasn't free. When an enslaved individual was officially liberated in a process called manumission, the state saw a golden opportunity for one last payday. They slapped a 5% tax, the vicesima manumissionis, on the person's assessed value. The question of who coughed up the cash was complicated. A generous former owner might cover it as a final gesture, but frequently, the enslaved person had to pay it themselves from whatever savings they'd scraped together, effectively meaning they had to buy their own freedom a second time. It was the ultimate commodification of human life. The government was so deeply enmeshed in the business of slavery that it had figured out how to make a profit not just from a person's labor in chains, but from the very moment they were set free. It was the state's final, cynical invoice for becoming a human being. 3. Back in 1696, England implemented what might be one of the most counterproductive taxes in history: the window tax. The government's logic seemed almost sound. The more windows you have, the wealthier you probably are. So they decided to tax houses based on their window count. The public's reaction was immediate and utterly predictable. People all over the country grabbed bricks and mortar and simply sealed their windows shut. Gorgeous buildings were suddenly scarred with ugly brick patches where windows used to be. This literal tax on daylight resulted in generations living in dark, dank, and horribly ventilated homes, which in turn became a breeding ground for disease. It was a perfect storm of bad policy, a tax so poorly conceived that it literally made the population sick and miserable, all for the sake of a few extra coins in the treasury. 4. We've all heard of pretty privilege, but how about a pretty privilege tax? While it was mostly a satirical idea, some feudal lords in Japan actually toyed with the concept of an ikemenze, which translates to a handsome man tax. The rationale was as bizarre as it sounds. Attractive men supposedly had an easier time in life, both in business and romance, so it was only fair they'd chip in a little extra. Can you imagine the assessment? All right, Mr. Tanaka, your jawline is exceptionally chiseled this year, and your smile is a threat to public order. That's going to be an extra 500 yen. This was basically the government attempting to put a price tag on charisma. While it never became a widespread national policy, it's a hilarious look into how far back the brainstorming for taxing absolutely everything goes. 5. There are few taxes in history that scream, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely," quite like the Ottoman Empire's dishkirası, or teeth tax. When a high-ranking official visited a provincial town, the local elites were obligated to throw him a massive feast. After gorging himself on the town's best food, the official would perform an act of stunning arrogance. He would then claim that the local food was so coarse and unrefined that it had damaged his delicate, sophisticated teeth. For this supposed dental distress, he demanded financial compensation from his hosts. This wasn't some under-the-table bribe. It was an officially recognized on-the-spot tax. It is the historical equivalent of a dinner guest eating all your food for free and then billing you for his dentist appointment on his way out the door. It was pure weaponized entitlement. 6. In 1797, British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger was desperate for money to fight Napoleon and landed on a truly wild idea. He decided to tax time itself. The clock tax was an enormous annual fee placed on every single clock and watch in the nation. The public's response was swift and total. People just stopped using clocks. They hid their watches, refused to buy new ones, and relied on public clocks to tell the time. The British watchmaking industry, which had been the best on the planet, was practically annihilated overnight as its customer base vanished. The tax was such a colossal failure, it raised almost no money while causing mass unemployment, that it was repealed less than 12 months later. It stands as a timeless lesson in how a tax can be so stupid that it completely destroys the very thing it's trying to profit from. 7. During China's Ming Dynasty, a huge chunk of the emperor's income flowed from the gate tax, a customs duty on any goods brought through the gates of major cities. For merchants, this tax could demolish their profits, so they became incredibly creative smugglers. The easiest method was the age-old tradition of simply bribing the guards. The more ambitious merchants would use ropes to haul their cargo over the city walls under the cover of darkness, avoiding the gates entirely. Others relied on clever concealment, hiding valuable items like silk or spices inside bulky, low-tax goods such as haystacks or loads of firewood. Some even dismantled their products into tiny pieces, hiding them in their clothing and making numerous trips, a slow but steady way to slip past the tax collector's watchful eyes. 8. Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't just a military mastermind, he was also a ruthless financial strategist. His core belief was brutally simple: war must pay for itself. As his Grande Armée swept across Europe, it wasn't just sustained by long supply lines from France. It was funded by what was effectively a conquest tax. Whenever Napoleon's army occupied a new territory, they would systematically impose massive taxes and contributions on the defeated population. They emptied state treasuries, plundered art from museums, and slapped heavy duties on the locals. In essence, it was a tax for the crime of having lost a war to him. The wealth of Italy, Prussia, and Austria was drained to pay the salaries, pensions, and supply costs of the French soldiers. It was a terrifyingly efficient system that forced Napoleon's enemies to finance their own occupation. 9. For centuries, the very act of having light in your home after dark was considered a taxable luxury in England. The candle tax, rolled out in 1709, slapped a massive levy on all candles made from wax or tallow. This effectively priced proper lighting out of reach for the poor, who were left with two options: sit in total darkness or use risky, foul-smelling alternatives. This gave rise to a booming black market for illegal candles, but the most common tax dodge was the rushlight. These were made by dipping the core of a rush plant into whatever leftover animal fat or bacon grease you had lying around. They burned fast, spewed out nasty smoke, and provided a pathetic amount of light, but crucially, they were not technically candles, and therefore, they were tax-free. For more than a century, the government's tax on light condemned millions to live in a dim, greasy, and perpetually stinking world. 10. If you think taxing something you can't even touch is a modern concept, let me introduce you to the Byzantine Empire's Erechon tax. This roughly translates to an air tax. And yes, it's every bit as nonsensical as it sounds. Now, it wasn't a fee for every breath you took, but it was dangerously close. It was a deliberately vague and undefined tax that collectors could impose on wealthy citizens for existing in a pleasant environment. Imagine a tax official strolling into your villa, gesturing around at your nice courtyard and saying, "You seem to be enjoying the general ambiance here. This feeling of well-being looks expensive." It was legalized extortion, a tool for the state to shake down the rich whenever the imperial piggy bank felt a bit light, proving that bureaucratic greed knows no limits. 11. In medieval England, Two of the king's primary cash cows were the tonnage and poundage taxes. Tonnage was a duty on every large barrel, or ton, of imported wine. Poundage was a tax based on the value of practically all other goods coming in or going out of the country. For centuries, Parliament would grant the king the right to collect these, but the rates were steep and merchants were clever. This tax system almost single-handedly launched a golden age of smuggling all along England's long coastline. In secret coves and shadowy harbors, smugglers would land everything from French wine to Flemish wool, completely avoiding the king's customs officers. For many, it became an almost patriotic endeavor, a way of getting goods to the people without the crown taking its massive cut, turning smuggling into one of the nation's biggest and most profitable underground economies. 12. In 1784, the British government was, as usual, scrounging for money to pay for its wars, this time with the newly formed United States. They settled on a very strange target: bricks. A tax was slapped on every single brick that was produced. The logic was that buildings are a sign of wealth, and this was an easy way to get a piece of the construction action. But British builders immediately found a brilliant and logical workaround. They just started making bigger bricks. Since the tax was per brick, not per pound of clay, using larger bricks meant you needed fewer of them to build something, which lowered your tax bill significantly. This sparked a short-lived architectural trend of buildings made with comically oversized bricks. The government, not amused by this cleverness, quickly retaliated by passing a law that set a maximum size for a legal brick, slamming the loophole shut. 13. The Danegeld in Anglo-Saxon England wasn't a tax in the way we think of one. It was essentially a nationwide protection racket run by the government itself. Beginning in the 9th century, Viking raiders were terrorizing the English countryside. The English kings, often unable to stop them with armies, chose another option. They paid the Vikings to just go away. This huge bribe was the Danegeld, or Dane gold. To raise the money, the king imposed a heavy tax on landowners across the entire kingdom. So, to be clear, English citizens were being taxed by their own king to bribe foreign invaders not to pillage their homes. It was a disastrous policy of appeasement, funded by the very people it was meant to protect, and it created a vicious cycle. The more the English paid, the more the Vikings came back looking for another payday. 14. The English poll tax of 1377 was a textbook example of how to make an entire country furious with a single law. Needing cash for the endless war with France, the government of King Richard II introduced a flat tax of 1 groat on every person over the age of 14, no matter how rich or poor they were. For a wealthy lord, this was nothing, but for a poor peasant, it was a devastating sum. The widespread anger and mass refusal to pay led directly to one of the biggest uprisings in English history, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Furious mobs marched on London, burning tax records and hunting down the officials responsible. Although the revolt was eventually put down, it was a violent and powerful message that a single, fundamentally unfair tax could push a kingdom to the very edge of collapse. 15. In 1791, the brand new United States government was desperate to pay off its Revolutionary War debt. The solution from Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton was the first ever federal tax on a domestic product: whiskey. But for farmers on the western frontier, this wasn't just a tax on a beverage, it was an attack on their entire way of life. For farmers in places like western Pennsylvania, distilling their grain into whiskey was the only realistic way to transport and sell it across the mountains. Whiskey was so vital it was even used as a form of currency. The farmers viewed the tax as an oppressive move by a faraway government and simply refused to pay. This exploded into the Whiskey Rebellion, where armed farmers tarred and feathered tax collectors. It became such a serious insurrection that President George Washington had to personally lead an army to crush it. 16. In his relentless quest to drag Russia into the modern era, Peter the Great decided the old system of taxing households was unfair and inefficient. His solution, introduced in 1718, was the soul tax. This was a poll tax charged for every single male soul in the Russian Empire, from newborn babies to the oldest men. But this seemingly logical system created a horribly grim side effect. The government would conduct a census to count all the male souls, and that official number would remain locked in for years until the next census. This meant families had to continue paying the tax for every male on that list, even if he had died. This led to a widespread practice of hiding deaths from the authorities for as long as possible. On the other end, they also hid the births of new baby boys, knowing that reporting a new soul meant adding a new tax burden for life. 17. In 1712, the British government decided to put a tax on soap, and in doing so, it accidentally declared a 141-year war on the very concept of being clean. The tax was so punishingly high that soap was instantly transformed from a daily essential into a luxury item. This had a couple of major social impacts. First, it created a massive black market for what was called bad soap, an illicit, smelly, and often skin-irritating product brewed in secret by smugglers. Tax collectors were given the power to burst into any home they suspected of illegal soap making. But more importantly, it made being clean too expensive for most people. For over a century, Britain became a demonstrably dirtier and less healthy nation, with the tax on basic hygiene directly contributing to the squalor and disease of the era. It wasn't until 1853 that the government finally conceded that taxing cleanliness was a terrible idea. 18. After winning the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell had a big army to pay for and a country full of his defeated enemies, the Royalists. His solution for funding the first by punishing the second was a move of ruthless political brilliance called the decimation tax. In 1655, a 10% income tax was slapped exclusively on known supporters of the defeated king. The money raised from this tax was then used to pay for the very militias that were occupying their lands and making sure they didn't cause any more trouble. It was the ultimate humiliation, forcing your political opponents to personally finance their own oppression. This tax wasn't just about raising funds. It was a cold, calculated strategy to financially cripple and demoralize the Royalists so they could never again challenge the new government. 19. There are unpopular taxes, and then there is the French gabelle, a tax on salt so deeply and universally despised that it fueled centuries of public fury and helped spark the French Revolution. The gabelle wasn't just a tax, it was a state-enforced monopoly on salt, a substance that was an absolute necessity for preserving food in a time before refrigeration. The government didn't just jack up the price, it forced every citizen over the age of 8 to buy a certain amount of it every year. This led to a huge smuggling trade, but the most ingenious tax dodge exploited a small loophole. Salt intended for livestock was untaxed. So, families would get a veterinarian to falsely declare their animals sick, which would get them a prescription for cheap animal-grade salt. They would then use this gritty, impure salt on their own food, all to escape a truly hateful tax. 20. When Tsar Peter the Great set out to modernize Russia, he saw a major obstacle to progress growing on the faces of his countrymen, the traditional Russian beard. To him, long beards were a symbol of everything old and backward. His solution, rolled out in 1698, was the beard tax. If you wanted to keep your facial hair, you had to pay a big annual fee. Once you paid, you were given a metal token, sometimes inscribed with the phrase, "The beard is a superfluous burden," that you had to carry around as your official beard license. While the wealthy in the cities were forced to either pay up or shave, the peasants in the countryside found a brilliant workaround. They realized they only needed to be clean-shaven when they went into a city. So they simply paid the tax as a one-time entry fee whenever they had to visit, turning an annual tax into a pay-per-use service. 21. The Romans were geniuses of engineering, but they were also geniuses of the petty, infuriating tax. In the bustling desert city of Palmyra, a key stop on the Silk Road, they didn't just tax the goods that merchants were selling. They actually taxed goods that simply passed by certain specific columns on the main street. Let that sink in for a moment. You're a merchant, you're hauling your goods, and a Roman official stops you. Not because you entered the city, not because you set up a stall, but because your camel happened to walk past the third pillar on the left. It was the ancient world's version of a completely pointless microtransaction, a toll booth in the middle of a road that existed for no other reason than because they could put one there. It's a perfect monument to bureaucratic nickel and diming. 22. Deeply concerned that Rome's upper class wasn't having enough babies, Emperor Augustus decided to use the tax code to legislate morality. He introduced a law that included a bachelor tax, a penalty fee on wealthy, unmarried men over the age of 38. The goal was to bully them into getting married and producing legitimate heirs for the noble families. However, Rome's elite bachelors, who very much enjoyed their freedom, discovered a loophole that was both legally airtight and completely ridiculous. They would enter into formal, legally binding engagements with very young girls, often toddlers. Because they were now officially betrothed, they were exempt from the tax. They could then delay the wedding for years, even decades, and then simply break off the engagement and start the process all over again, hilariously defeating Augustus's grand moral plan with some clever paperwork. 23. Not satisfied with taxing daylight itself, the British government also decided to tax fashion. In 1784, they slapped a complex tax on men's hats, with the fee varying based on the hat's price. Retailers needed a special license, and every single hat had to have a stamp inside it proving the tax had been paid. But the hat makers were a clever bunch. They simply stopped calling their products hats. All of a sudden, shops were selling a wide variety of head coverings, cranial accessories, and other absurdly named items. It became a linguistic game of cat and mouse with the taxman. Is this a hat? Certainly not, sir. This is a stylish piece of felt intended for the cranium, a completely different thing. It was a perfect act of malicious compliance that forced the government to make the law even more complicated to close the very silly loophole. 24. In the Mughal Empire of India, the tax system was often used as a tool for social and religious engineering. The Jizya was a yearly tax that was levied on non-Muslim subjects living under Mughal authority. In theory, it was a fee paid in exchange for the state's military protection and the right to practice their own religion. In practice, however, it created a powerful financial incentive to convert to Islam. For a poor family, the annual burden of the jizya could be crippling. By converting, that tax burden would instantly disappear. While countless people held on to their beliefs, it's undeniable that for some, the decision to convert was a purely economic one. It was a system where the state of your eternal soul could directly impact the state of your wallet, making religious conversion one of history's most spiritually significant tax dodges. 25. The Roman Emperor Caligula was known for his cruelty, but he was also famously desperate for cash to fund his absurdly extravagant lifestyle. When the usual tax revenues started to dry up, he invented one of the most predatory taxes imaginable: a direct levy on sex workers. This was far beyond a simple business license for a brothel. Caligula's law taxed the earnings from every single client a prostitute served. To make sure he got his cut, he sent Roman soldiers into the brothels to act as on-site tax collectors, demanding the state's share the moment a transaction was complete. This created a deeply disturbing and invasive system, turning a private act into a state-monitored, taxable event enforced by armed men. It was a cynical cash grab that showed there was no aspect of a citizen's life too private for the state to intrude upon for profit. 26. If you've ever looked at pictures of Amsterdam and wondered why so many of the old houses are incredibly tall and skinny, the answer is a brilliant piece of historical tax avoidance. During the Dutch Golden Age, the city's property tax was calculated based on the width of a building's front facade. The logic was simple: a wider house means a richer owner. So, the clever Dutch architects and homeowners of the era responded by building upwards instead of outwards. They constructed homes on impossibly narrow plots of land, sometimes just wide enough for a door and one window, but stretching 4 or 5 stories high. This iconic architectural style, which gives Amsterdam its unique and beautiful canal front look, was born directly from a collective desire to give the taxmen as little as possible. The entire city is a gorgeous monument to tax evasion. 27. Roman Emperor Vespasian was a practical man who believed that if something could be taxed, it should be taxed. When he needed to refill Rome's depleted treasury, his eyes fell upon the city's public urinals. He immediately slapped a tax on the collection of urine, which, believe it or not, was a valuable commodity. Tanners used the ammonia in it to process leather, and launderers used it to bleach togas. When his own son, Titus, complained that making money from human waste was disgusting, Vespasian famously held a gold coin under his son's nose and asked if it smelled bad. When Titus said no, Vespasian delivered the immortal line, "And yet it comes from urine." This gave the world the famous phrase, pecunia non olet, or money does not stink, and proved that no source of revenue was beneath the emperor. 28. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's power was so absolute that he didn't just own the land, he owned the entire economy. This included a state monopoly on cooking oil, an essential product used for everything from preparing food to lighting lamps. Naturally, the pharaoh taxed it heavily. But the paranoia of the Egyptian bureaucracy led to an enforcement method of almost comical intrusiveness. The state hired an army of official auditors who would conduct surprise inspections of private homes. These ancient tax agents would barge into kitchens to make sure people were using the official taxed oil and not some black market substitute. They would even check if a family was illegally reusing old oil to avoid buying more. Imagine trying to enjoy a quiet evening, only for a government official to storm in and start sniffing your frying pan to see if you're a tax cheat. 29. In the medieval German town of Wiesensteig, the government had a serious pest problem. Sparrows were eating all the valuable grain. To solve this, they created a policy that was part tax, part civic duty. Every citizen was required to kill and turn in 12 sparrows per year. If you met your quota, you got a small tax credit. But if you failed to produce your dozen dead birds, you were hit with a fine, which was effectively a sparrow tax. This created a bizarre local economy centered on dead sparrows. Skilled hunters could kill more than their quota and then sell the surplus birds to their less skilled or busier neighbors. It was a strange but effective example of a government outsourcing its pest control directly to the taxpayers, with financial penalties for anyone who wasn't a good enough bird killer. 30. In medieval England, if you were a knight, your job was to fight for the king. But what if you were a knight who preferred fine wine and comfort over muddy battlefields? You could pay scutage, a fee that became known as the cowardice tax. This was a legal way to buy yourself out of military service. Initially, it was a practical system, but then along came King John, who treated scutage like his own personal cash machine. He started demanding it at insane rates, even when there was no war to fight, turning it into a mandatory subscription fee for being a pacifist. His constant abuse of this tax and others made the barons so profoundly angry that it became a major catalyst for them, forcing him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document which, ironically, was born from a tax on not fighting. 31. Ancient Rome was known for its incredible engineering, but its most vital project was the Cloaca Maxima, or the Greatest Sewer. This massive underground network was a public works marvel that kept the city from drowning in its own filth. But of course, it wasn't free. To pay for its construction and endless maintenance, the Roman state created a special sewer tax for its citizens. This is one of the earliest known examples of a tax dedicated specifically to sanitation. And while nobody likes paying taxes, this was probably one of the few where people could see, and more importantly smell, the direct benefits. Every time they walked down a street that wasn't an open cesspool, they had their sewer tax to thank for it, establishing the timeless principle that a civilized city has to pay for its plumbing. 32. In the Belgian city of Ypres, cats were once vital for keeping the rats out of the valuable cloth halls. But as the cat population grew, the city decided to tax cat owners. Now, a normal city might have just paid the tax or gotten rid of a few cats. According to a very dark local legend, Ypres came up with a truly horrific tax dodge. Instead of paying, the citizens allegedly used their annual cat festival as a brutal accounting method. They would gather up the surplus, taxable felines, and simply throw them from the top of the town's belfry tower. This wasn't just tax evasion, it was a city-sanctioned, gravity-assisted massacre to balance the budget. It is a grim reminder that when pushed, people can come up with some truly insane solutions to avoid a tax. Thankfully, the modern festival now wisely throws toy cats instead. We've journeyed through 32 monuments to fiscal insanity, but history is a deep and ridiculous well. So the challenge is this. What's the one completely absurd historical tax we failed to mention? I want to see the most obscure and unbelievable examples you can find in the comments below. While you're down there proving your superior knowledge, execute the like button and subscribe for more historical madness.